It's a pleasure to be here with you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be. This life of ours. Well, I'm going to tell you a few stories that draw your attention towards the subject of dying with a very specific intention. I'm a physician, and I work with people who face their death in the hospital. And every day, I have to remind myself of something that's probably pretty obvious to you. Dying is not a medical experience. Dying is a human experience. And what's more, it's your human experience. So I'll guide you within yourself to discover a certain natural understanding and calm that I know exists. It may serve you well someday. It serves me well today. Now, dying is not always beautiful. In fact, it's seldom very easy. And sometimes it's very difficult or even impossible when it's happening to recognize that death is always illuminated by soul, deep in meaning and brimming with actionable wisdom. So as a participant observer, I'm going to bring into view for you things that are rarely seen and even more rarely seen clearly. So for a few minutes, join me in a front row seat to the boundary zone where living and dying meet. So my first memory of human death was when I was 6 years old, my grandfather's funeral. The memory is wrapped up in a big set of emotions, confusion and fear and anger. I felt so alone. None of it made any sense. Now, in my family, like many others, but it doesn't take a physicist to recognize how nonlinear and subjective and human the experience of time is. Tell a child to wait an actual minute, or tell me that it's been 7 years since the birth of my daughter Bella. So much can happen in an instant, and a whole life can seem to pass in a blink. How we regret the past and how we worry about the future, we can lose ourselves. Well, in a pretty long haul, I watched a family find themselves. So I approach the room in the hospital where a woman is. We had to suppress her consciousness to stop her terrible seizures. And I step through the door, and 12 or more sets of eyes turn, stop, and stare at me. The doctor has entered. Well, I felt like I was going to suffocate under the weight of their sadness, and I wanted to run away from the tension of their impatience. But I didn't. I did what I always do, which is to manage myself, to manage my fear that I would fail them. I remember particularly the eldest son. He was an important businessman, and he was quite disconnected, separated from his sisters and from his family. And he said to me, I'm way too busy to stay. But he stayed anyway for the entire 23 days of her miraculous dying. You know, I can always tell when it's going well when the hand-wringing stops and the stories come forward and the room fills with equal parts laughter and tears. Well, that's what happened here. It's in the stories that you can really feel a person. Well, they laughed and they cried and they told stories and they connected with each other in a way I'm certain they never had before. In those 23 days, I watched the reintegration of a family that I'm pretty sure could span generations. Now, is it true that there's never enough time? What is a whole life? How many moments make a life? I crossed paths once with an infant whose whole life was held in love and devotion. Late in pregnancy, they discovered an unsurvivable heart defect. So this child, this boy, his whole life, his eyes were filled with the vision of his adoring parents, and his ears were filled with the sound of flute and prayer. My role was just to stand with the parents and the midwives while they found the courage to create a container for a natural birth, a whole life, and a natural death, all passing in the space of an hour's passage on the clock. What has awed me the most is watching people embrace the immediacy of their lives, no matter what the circumstances. Here's two love stories. The first story, it belongs to a young man who was dying quickly from a newly diagnosed cancer. The second story belonged to a young woman whose cancer recurrence was discovered at the time she delivered her third child. For both of them, their attention was dominated by love, and life was affirmed by their choices. So this young man, he'd been living with his partner or fiancé for a number of years, and they had every intention to get married once he got his business squared away. Well, I pulled out my Universal Life minister's card, and I married them 2 hours before he died. On his face, I saw the tears and smile that were so familiar to me because they were the same as mine when I got married. Now, this woman, she insisted on marrying her partner and marrying her 2 children, her 2 sons, to her partner before she would accept the aggressive and dangerous treatment that was offered to her to give her an outside chance at survival. So, her family and her partner created a whole wedding in the hospital chapel. I mean, a whole wedding. There was a minister, there was live music, there was a cake, a dress, rice, flowers, everything. And there was also all of their people who came from all over the place to show up for love. So this woman, she got her life squared away. She handled her life on her own terms before she accepted the treatment that was offered. Consider this. Would you rather die instantly without any warning, like a bus gets you from behind? Or would you prefer something a little more gradual? Well, for you bus people, is it physical symptoms that worry you? Or is it the gravity of having to face your own life, your own death? If it's the gravity of facing your own death, that's yours to manage. But if it's physical symptoms, physical distress, remember that I told you this today. The physical distress is most often manageable. Not always, but most often. I knew a woman whose mother, in the last year of her life, created a series of videotapes for her daughter, who was 7 years old at the time of her death. This mother and her husband generated age and developmentally appropriate messages that she could send through the camera's lens and into her daughter's future. There was one for every birthday and for special occasions like graduation, the day of her wedding, and the day that she gave birth to her first child. So this mother, she used the time she had to express her love and dedication to her daughter. And it mattered. This mother's willingness was to face the reality of her situation. Now, would you or I be as willing to do that? I don't know, but I hope so. In situations where we face our own death, it actually helps to be deeply related to reality. For those unfamiliar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she was a pioneer who had the amazing insight to actually ask dying people themselves about their experience. She took this research and she crafted a model, the famous 5 stages of dying: anger, depression, bargaining, denial, and acceptance. Well, I'm very grateful for Dr. Kubler-Ross, and I'm very understanding for those that struggle with anger, bargaining, denial, and depression. But in my business, I've learned that acceptance is a better guide to decision-making when death is imminent. I was called to the bedside of a man who had a small and solitary lung cancer. He was hoping for a surgical cure. Well, his chances for success were excellent. But reality intervened in the form of irreversible and ultimately fatal complications. For the past few weeks, he was dependent on a face mask that blew air in and out through his broken lungs. And it was my job to manage and navigate through the anger of his family and my own shame regarding the failures of my medical system. Well, my job was also to tell him the truth, that he wasn't going to survive this illness. And when I told him that he was going to die, he reached up and took my hand in a gesture of reassurance. He asked, "What's next, Doc?" So I asked him, "What's most important to you?" He then gathered up all the people in his life that he wanted to say goodbye to, and he brought them to him. He said, "I'll do it tomorrow at high noon." High noon, his words. And so he gathered these people together. He had dozens of encounters. Those encounters actually washed away most of his family's anger. And for me, it was laughter and tears again that had me relax. So at noon the next day, in the presence of 15 or so family members and friends, he reached up and he pulled off the mask to show a smile and a sparkle in his eye. I swear I felt him enter my heart when he died. You know, I carry many tools with me from my traditional medical training, but it's midwifery that I find my inspiration. Midwives have supported the delivery of more than 98% of human beings ever born. They've learned to do this by observation, complete dedication, in the storm of vulnerability and intensity that is childbirth. This miracle of birth, the process itself, has taught generations of midwives. These midwives, they know that they must trust the process. They know that they must embody the bravery that is patience. These midwives, like warriors, know that they must take action only and exactly when necessary, and not a moment before or a moment after. In the care of the emergent human being, or in the retreating life of a dying person, less is more. It's also true that 98% of human beings that have ever died have done so in their own homes, attended to by their families. The various healers that have stood behind these families over the years have never been able to change the dying. But they've always brought the tools that they've had, and they've showed up to a human process that they trust. Whether the doctors or shamans or nurses or midwives or family, what matters most at the side of a dying human being is presence. Now, in my family, we prepared like crazy for birth in our home. For our dying, this miracle of death, we rarely prepare at all. We back into the single most potent life experience, and we find ourselves surprised when we're confronted by what's been broadcast to us from within us since the first inkling of our self-awareness. Now, a little old lady I fell in love with a long time ago, Ruth Gordon, said, "I love people. They're my species." Well, I am enchanted to be one of us, this family of human beings. Here we are, people, here and now. When it comes your time to die, remember that just as your life was always yours to own, your death is yours as well. And when you get the opportunity to serve or merely witness the dying of a fellow human being, manage yourself so that you can be present. Don't just do something. Sit there. Thank you.